You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 2, Burglary, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 16. Party to a Disaster. Kuro's obligation to Bindle forced him to do something he truly didn't want to do. He'd avoided it all year and had convinced himself that he could go on avoiding it forever. But after a week of trying and failing to get anything at all to happen, and with considerable encouragement from his friends, he stayed after class to study. As class let out at the end of the day on Friday, Kuro asked Ms. McCutcheon to borrow a familiar summoning manual. "I thought you weren't going to concern yourself with your familiar," replied the principal with a tone of someone claiming victory in an argument. Kuro wasn't certain if he was allowed to teach Luton how to summon a familiar. They'd been told not to show the younger students, but Bindle wasn't a student. Still, he thought it best not to bother her with the details. "I changed my mind," he said after what was probably too long a pause. Ms. McCutcheon took even longer to respond. She looked down at him, obviously not believing him, but unable to think of a reason or motivation for lying. She slowly retrieved one of the manuals from a locked drawer and handed it to him hesitantly. "The book does not leave the room, understood?" "Of course," he agreed, and then sat down at his usual desk for some review while Ms. McCutcheon got on with some paperwork. The book was uncooperative. Kuro had hoped there would be some key element he'd missed in the noise and excitement of the formal lesson, but it yielded no new insights. He had the words right, he knew all the movements and gestures, and all the instructions about tuning his mind were clear. They didn't make any sense, but they were clear. Meditate on home and family in the key of E-flat major, then find connections to the words of the spell. Most of those were about comfort, stability, and unhindered self-expression. It might as well have asked him to swallow gravel or sing underwater. He had been sorting through it for nearly an hour, interrupted only by the occasional shifting of papers, but the silence was broken by the principal demanding his attention. "Kuro, could you come here for a moment?" she said, cutting the quiet and startling Kuro into the rafters. It took a few moments for his heart rate to calm enough to understand what she'd asked. He climbed down and obediently approached her desk. "Could you kindly explain this?" said Ms. McCutcheon, presenting him with a sheaf of paper. "It's my homework." It was a report on self-perpetuating spiritual entities he'd submitted a couple weeks prior. He had worked hard on it due to her warnings earlier in the year about how he'd be able to pass without casting anything. He was proud of it, but her tone of voice told him that he'd done something terribly wrong. "That's quite apparent," she said. "But why is it written in reverse?" "I'm left-handed," he replied. He had started the year still writing with his right hand, worried that he'd be punished for using his left, but it was so much easier with his left hand that he had drifted to it over time. She started to question him but couldn't find the words. The unflappable principal tried 3 times to get a word out and then gave up. She stacked papers neatly while her brow furrowed in thought. Then she balanced her chin on peaked fingers and stared at him, squinting. She looked him up and down as if she'd never laid eyes on him or anything like him. It was uncomfortable. Kuro wasn't certain what he was supposed to do. He shuffled and fidgeted and regretted staying late. "I may have made a miscalculation," she said at last. When she failed to elaborate, Kuro asked, "Am I in trouble?" The principal stood and walked around her desk so that she could loom over Kuro. "I believe that we have somewhat misjudged your difficulties with magic." "I'm just bad at it," Kuro said. "That has been our assumption as well," Ms. McCutcheon nodded. "We believed you simply to be behind the other students, and through hard work and perseverance, you would catch up. Yet, despite your considerable efforts, you appear to be making little progress." "So I am in trouble," Kuro said, unsure if he was understanding what she was trying to get at. "No, Kuro." She settled into a more teacherly voice as she continued. "The foundations of magical practice rely on thought. In order to provide the evocations and incantations taught here, one must comport one's thoughts exactly correctly. The methods of instruction employed have been developed over generations as the most reliable method for establishing those patterns of thought in new spellcasters. However, those methods are based on the fundamental assumption that all of our students think in roughly the same ways and have similar experiences. So I am bad at magic then, Kuro repeated, still not understanding where she was going. I'm not convinced of that at all, she said. You are able to manifest magical effects as well as any student, just not the ones expected. It's not that you are bad at magic, but rather that we are bad at teaching you magic. You think differently than most children, and so our methods do not work for you. What do you mean? Asked Kuro. She retrieved his homework from her desk and showed it to him as though he hadn't written it himself. Most left-handed students still write in the same direction as right-handed ones. The words would go in the same direction. But then I'd have to write all the letters backwards and I'd smear the ink. Of course, she said. That's very sensible. But most people would argue that the direction of the words is the important part, not the movement of your hand. Oh, was all Kuro could think to say. He felt very foolish for having thought otherwise. I'll go back to writing the other way then. Not necessary. Ms. McCutcheon, with a tuneful whistle and a complicated series of gestures, pulled the ink through the page to the other side so it read in the normal right-handed direction. In this, at least, we should be able to accommodate you. However, I worry that you may have a difficult time ahead that we are ill-prepared to help with. Us teaching you magic may be like trying to describe color to the blind. Hopeless then, said Kuro. No, responded Ms. McCutcheon, but it will be challenging for you. We do our best, but we can only teach magic in the way we understand it ourselves. However, the methods we teach are not the only methods which work. They're not? That was at odds with everything he'd been taught so far. Consider the spell for summoning a familiar, for example. She picked up the manual. It assumes a certain upbringing and outlook, as it tries to establish the correct thought processes for the conjuring through words and actions and preparatory meditations. However, none of it is necessary. Do you think the first person who conjured a familiar performed that entire spell? No? Kuro had never thought about it, but the way she asked it made it seem like a foolish idea. Quite right. It was something that came quite naturally to them. Much like Marie's ability to make things change colors. The spell we learn was developed as a way for others to reproduce the same effects. But with practice, some of the steps can be skipped. She stopped speaking and her eyes lost focus. A few moments later, streamers of blue light peeled out of the air and coiled into the shape of a tall bird. Without so much as a wave of her hand, she fully and completely summoned her familiar. Kuro applauded the impressive display of skill. The critical component of conjuring a familiar is self-understanding, she explained. One must know who one is and to project that with confidence and certainty. Why don't they just say that in the book? Kuro complained. Because if we tell a student to be themselves, they will inevitably think about who they want to be or who they believe they should be. Instead, the meditations guide most students through situations where they feel most at peace with who they truly are. So I should think more like a wizard, said Kuro. Ms. Crawley told me that last year. I need to be more lazy. Ms. McCutcheon's face tensed as if trying to hold in a sneeze. Not quite, Kuro. I suspect trying to change yourself to suit the spell, particularly this spell, will fail. Instead, you might try to change the spell to suit you. With that cryptic advice, she sent Kuro to the lodge for dinner. He wandered home while trying to make sense of McCutcheon's advice. Just like the instruction manual, he understood everything she'd said, and none of it made any sense to him. As he walked in the front door, an explosion of noise shook him from his thoughts, and he found himself entangled in the rafters for a second time that evening. Below him were all the other second-year lodgers, teeth bared. "Surprise!" they had shouted. Behind them was a dining hall table, which had been moved to the lounge and set with dinner and a cake in the middle that was slightly on fire. "Were you surprised?" demanded Charlie, as though Kuro might have jumped to the ceiling for some other reason. "Yes." Kuro said, confused at why everyone seemed so eager for his response. Is that good? He turned to Marie in hopes she'd make some sense of the situation, but she just said, Mukachin kept you longer than I thought she would. What? Said Kuro. She didn't keep me, I stayed. And whose idea was that? She replied with a sly grin. I don't understand. Why would you make me stay late just to scare me? Jennifer Tanaka groaned. You seriously don't get it? It's a birthday party. Your birthday party? Now come eat, the food's going cold. He sat at the table and had the flaming cake shoved towards him. It was lopsided and unevenly iced, with over a dozen burning candles jammed in the top of it. We made it for you, said Charlie proudly. Or Marie and Allie made it for you because they know how to bake, but I got to lick the spoon for the icing, which was pretty great. So are you going to blow it out or what? Kuro did as he was asked. He summoned up a little gust of wind, which blew out the candles and peeled off a chunk of icing that splattered across the table. You are so weird, said Magna Singh. Have you really never had a birthday before? Nope, said Kuro. First time. I'm not really sure what to do. Usually you get presents and eat too much sugar and hang out with friends, said Sean Cassidy as he dug into his dinner. Sometimes you go bowling. At least that's what we do in the Blandlands. I don't know what y'all do out here. Depends a bit where you're from, said Gregory Zimmerman. I think the Acadians get new clothes and Alfheim kids have duels. Proper Tiernanog families just sit around drinking tea and being boring. Low-born folks like me do pretty much the same as you Blandos, except for the bowling part. Kuro had been flustered by the attention at the beginning of the meal, but soon everyone started talking to each other about their various birthday parties and the strange traditions of their homes. The Fireflies were all curious about the Fey Realm, and the Fey Realm kids were fascinated by the peculiarities in the Blandlands. It let Kuro relax and eat for a while. When dinner was finished, Charlie cut and served the cake. It made a couple of the others uncomfortable that she did it without using her hands. A long, sharp blade flying around of its own accord was unsettling on its own, but the way it drifted around weightlessly when she was delivering a slice made people nervous. It wasn't a good cake. They apparently hadn't had all the ingredients they needed, and they had to bake it from memory. So it was a bit mushy and didn't really taste of anything but sugar. Still, that was enough to be delicious. There were even some leftovers, which Kuro put on a shelf in his bag for Bindle. Dinner ended for everyone else in the dining hall, and a few people started to occupy the lounge, wandering through to their rooms or taking up space by the fire. But none invaded the party, except for a bullfrog. Oliver's familiar had made its way onto the table, where it hopped around, inspecting people's plates and croaking occasionally. It was uncanny how like Oliver it was. It didn't look like him, but something in the way it moved just seemed right. It was confident but halting in its movements. It sat like it might fight anyone at the slightest provocation, but at the same time looked ready to bolt. And despite having the impassive face of a frog, it wore the same expression as Oliver of having been caught in a lie. How did you make your familiar? Kuro asked. Oliver was surprised and confused by the question. I cast the spell, he stammered in response. I mean, why did you get it so easily? Asked Kuro. You were the first lodger to do it. Oliver blushed a little at the recognition. Oh, don't know. I just like casting spells. It's the only time I don't stutter. When I practice the words enough, they just come out right and it feels good. I was just kind of enjoying it and then it worked. All of a sudden, there was a frog. It just happened. What about you, Arthur? You had an easy time of it. I was surprised, said Arthur, expressing none of said surprise. I just thought about home like it said. As the conversation involved familiars, Charlie was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. A very noisy moth that knocked things over when she got excited. You are so lucky! I've been trying to cast it every night and it's always the same. I keep trying to make the fluff stick together, but it never listens. I told you that it doesn't work if you force it, said Arthur. You have to let it be what it is. Charlie nodded sagely at the wise advice she'd already received a dozen times before forgetting it completely. What about you, Sean? It was easy for you. What's your secret? Sean flushed so red that it could be seen through his orange hair. I wouldn't say that it was easy, he said. It was actually really hard. There's a bit in the spell about being honest about your desires, and I've been kind of feeling something for a while. So I cast the spell when I was thinking about that, and the whole thing just clicked, you know? And then when I saw my familiar, it was obvious. His hummingbird familiar buzzed twice around his head, then perched on Gregory Zimmerman's shoulder and nuzzled his cheek. See? It likes Greg. Familiars can't like people, sneered Allie. It's not even a real animal. Gregory elbowed Allie in the ribs. He means it's the same as him, you twit. Sean turned redder than a tomato, and Gregory just looked pleased with himself. Charlie, as usual, was the first to find words. Are you two going out? That is so cute. I mean, we all knew, but we didn't know. But we pretty much knew. You have to tell us every little detail. Who asked who and when, and were there flowers? The whole table engaged in the interrogation of Sean and Gregory. As the first of their lot to have the misfortune of being openly engaged in a romantic entanglement, the questions were relentless. Kuro had little to contribute and didn't pay much attention. Instead, he noticed Magna Singh's behavior. She had gone very quiet as Sean explained his summoning. She slid out of her chair and quietly performed the ritual while others were arguing. A tangle of glowing orange cords grew up from the floor and twisted together like vines. First, they formed what looked like 4 trees, then branched out and expanded to form a tall, powerful caribou, with antlers that threatened to knock the wagon wheel chandelier off the ceiling. It shook itself along its length, and a full coat of brown fur emerged. Magna looked at it in stunned amazement, and it nuzzled her gently. Then the table erupted in applause. Morgan threw her arms around her roommate in celebration. You were right, Sean, said Magna. It is kinda obvious once you see it. She patted the huge creature on the flank. Magna's sudden success spurred into action the others who had not yet manifested their familiars. Everyone except Marie and Kuro started casting or coaching. Are you not going to join them? Asked Marie. Not right now, said Kuro. I think I'll watch. He thought he might learn something from seeing the successes of others. What about you? He asked. I will not bother with it, she said. Like Ms. McCutcheon said, it's not important. It is better to spend the time on other things. What other things she spoke of wasn't clear, as she didn't go anywhere or pull out her homework. Kuro watched as his fellow lodgers tried to teach each other how to summon their familiars. Older students stopped by and offered pointers and demonstrations, occasionally forcing curious first-years out of the room. The advice from the older students was inconsistent and often contradictory. They said certain parts weren't important, and then others would insist that those same parts were critical. Some said it was best to cast in a place they knew well, like their bedroom. Others explained that their first success was trying to cast in the environment where their familiar would naturally live. What slowly became clear was that not a single person was casting the same spell. They all said the same words and made the same movements, but their focus was all different, and everyone adapted it just a little to better suit themselves. Ali Khaldun was the next to get his familiar to form, and it raised a panic. Eagles, bears, and lions barely raised an eyebrow, but the fluffy little black creature, with a pair of white stripes down its back, sent people diving for cover. It's not a real animal, said Ali, defending his skunk. It doesn't have the internal organs to spray. Morgan Greenwood also succeeded and conjured an otter, which was both playful and friendly, and proved much more popular than Ali's familiar. The most earnest of participants was Charlie by a mile. She cast over and over with the same results that she got in class. A cloud of glittering white fluff that swirled and failed to converge into anything. She's trying really hard, isn't she? Kuro said to Marie, noting how unusual it was for her to spend more than a few minutes on anything. Yes, and it's always the same, Marie observed. She gets distracted at the end and gets clumsy, so it falls apart. Kuro watched again. It was true. Charlie did get clumsy at the end, but lots of people's casting was sloppier than hers. What seemed to be happening was that she would start watching the fluff swirl around her, so while her mouth and body were still going through the motions, her brain was too busy watching the show. I have a dumb idea, said Kuro as he climbed off his chair. Could I borrow your headband? Marie was suspicious but curious enough to pass over the band of stretchy fabric she used to hold back her explosion of curly hair. He wove through the room full of creatures and spellcasters to where Charlie had cleared herself an area to practice. I think you should stop watching what you're doing, said Kuro. It was a strange enough thing to say that Charlie paused her endless repetitions. Huh? You keep watching your fluff, but that isn't working, Kuro tried to explain. So don't look at it. Put this over your eyes. Charlie thought about it for a split second before pulling the headband over her head, effectively blinding herself. "You're a genius! Has anyone ever told you that?" she said to the space slightly to the right of him. "Definitely not," he replied as he stepped back to give her space. She began again. Soon the drifting cloud of glowing dandelion fluff began to stick together. But, undistracted by the scene, Charlie kept going. More and more of the fluff emerged and coalesced until the form it was creating was unreasonably large for the space of the lounge. In a final bright flash of light, the outer coating of fluff burst off, leaving the fully formed creature beneath. "Did it work?" demanded Charlie to the room, which had been stunned into silence. A string of multilingual profanity from Marie summed up the feelings of everyone present. Charlie ripped off the headband to see her familiar, gleaming white, a full head taller than Magnus Caribou, with a single white horn and feathered wings that spread across the whole room. She ran her hand along the flank of the winged unicorn in disbelief. After a minute of stunned silence, Charlie suddenly turned and thrust the headband at Kuro. "You go next!" It was a silly idea. Kuro didn't have the same problems as Charlie, but he also knew that she would not leave him alone until he tried. He covered his eyes and thought about all the things he'd learned that day. He contemplated what it meant to be his true self, what he was distracted by, what deep truths he was struggling with. And then to let that all just be as it was. He began to cast. He did feel something, maybe a tingle of connection to what he was saying. There was some reaction from those around him too, but he tried to ignore it. Yet that reaction quickly grew to be a series of coughs, shouts, and demands to stop. He pulled off the blindfold to find the room swirling with a thick gray smoke, with him at the center of the maelstrom. People and familiars pounded past him, blindly seeking an exit. He was buffeted and trampled, and just as the storm was starting to abate, someone spooked Ellie's skunk and it sprayed the room. In less than a minute, the building had evacuated, and Kuro was left alone, surrounded by lingering smoke, toppled furniture, and broken dishes, absolutely stinking of skunk. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.